everyone, and welcome to episode 243 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Medieval historians are faced with the daunting task of having to piece together around 1,000 years of history without all that many written sources to speak of. Unfortunately, this is true of even big, earth-shattering events. But what happens if it turns out that some of the most important sources we've been using have been, let's say, touched up a little? And what does that tell us about how medieval people saw their own recent past? This week I spoke with Dr. Thomas Smith about letters from the First Crusade. Tom is an honorary research fellow at Royal Holloway, the University of Kent, and Oxford Brookes University, as well as formerly being a lecturer in medieval history at Trinity College Dublin. He's the author of Curia and Crusade, Pope Honorius III and the Recovery of the Holy Land, 1216 to 1227. And he's the editor or co-editor of 7 other books, including Authority and Power in the Medieval Church, circa 1000 to circa 1500, and Remembering the Crusades in Medieval Texts and Songs. His new book is Rewriting the First Crusade, Epistolary Culture in the Middle Ages. Our conversation on the letters we have from the First Crusade, which ones are either partially or wholly invented, and what this discovery means to our understanding of the Crusades is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Tom, for coming to join me to talk about letter writing and the First Crusade. It's so nice to meet you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Danielle. I'm a long-time listener, so I'm really thrilled to be here.
It's my pleasure. And I love it when people say they're a long-time listener because, it's the 5th year of the podcast. And I love that there are people who've been with it since the beginning. So, and yeah, people who are writing books on the Crusade and listening. So thanks so much. So before we get started, it's important to establish, I think, which crusade we're talking about, because there are a bunch of them. So you're mentioning the First Crusade. What are we talking about when we're talking about the First Crusade?
Okay, so the First Crusade, the traditional dates of it are 1095 to 1099, but I think actually in the book I argue that we should extend the First Crusade to go up to 1101 and the sort of subsequent waves of the Crusade that happen. Most historians date its origin to November 1095 when Pope Urban II launches the Crusade at the Council of Clermont in France, where he preaches this message saying that people should go to the East to liberate the Eastern churches and rescue the Christians there. And then probably, not entirely sure, but he might also have mentioned Jerusalem. Certainly that idea becomes very popular as a target of the crusade. So it's an armed pilgrimage which taps into these undercurrents in society of religious devotion that have started to coalesce around mass pilgrimage to Jerusalem and defense of churches. There's a sort of longer backstory as well, whereby the Byzantine Empire, which is centered on the city of Constantinople, which is modern Istanbul, had been under attack from the Seljuk Turks in the east, and they were losing a lot of territory. There have been key battles like the Battle of Manzikert at 1071, where they've lost a lot of territory, and so they're sending appeals to the west for aid. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sends requests to Urban II at the Council of Piacenza in 1095 and requests military aid to help him defend his empire. He's probably expecting a few hundred armed knights and sort of hardened mercenaries to go out, and actually what he gets is this, flood of humanity that appears on his doorstep and causes a huge problem. So there's a kind of mismatch in expectations from the start, I think. The papacy, Urban II, spreads this message in his preaching tours. It becomes incredibly popular. There's a great rumor that spreads throughout France and other European lands, and people sign up for the crusade. They take the cross and they start to leave and go to the east, to go to Jerusalem to fight on behalf of Christ. And they're doing that because they've been offered remission of sin. So any sins that they've committed, they can have the slate wiped clean, essentially, and it's almost like a get into heaven free card. So there's a lot of reasons for people to go, and they kind of center on mostly religious devotion, but there's other people going for perhaps adventure, to escape their lives in the West, and to travel, obviously to go on pilgrimage. And so there's a multitude of reasons. I don't think we should look at it in terms of going for a single motivation or kind of binary opposition between going for material wealth or religious devotion. They then march through Europe and make their way to the Holy Land. There's two main waves. There's the Princes wave, which leaves in August 1096, and it's well organized. It's led by a number of French and Norman princes who have really well organized contingents. But there's also a wave before that, which historians have called the People's Crusade. Previously, it was called the Peasants' Crusade, but it's a bit of a misnomer because actually you've got a lot of knights involved as well. And they commit horrific atrocities, massacring Jewish populations along the Rhineland. And then it kind of peters out. They get to Constantinople and then they're destroyed in Asia Minor. When the princes manage to get to Constantinople, they have to strike a deal with Alexios about retaking territory and a military alliance. And then they start this campaign down through Asia Minor and down towards Jerusalem. They capture some big cities along the way, like Nicaea and Antioch, which is a particularly grueling siege. And then in July 1099, they capture the city of Jerusalem, their target. This is the seat of Christianity, Latin Christianity in the medieval world. It's the kind of center point, the navel of their world. And they capture the Holy Sepulchre, which is the church built over Christ's tomb, Christ's empty tomb. It's the place where he died and was resurrected. And so this is the most important site in all of Christianity, and they've captured it. There's a kind of epilogue in the Battle of Ascalon where they managed to face off a massive Egyptian army and defeat them as well. And the whole crusade is seen as from a Latin Christian perspective, as a miraculous event. It's unbelievable, really. They've managed to march across the face of the known world and capture these cities, including Jerusalem, really against the odds. And it's been a really brutal campaign. It's a really savage campaign involving cannibalism as well, and really grueling trial at the Siege of Antioch, for instance, which takes 9 months. So they've really see themselves being tested along the way. And this sparks off the whole crusading movement, really. They start to establish then Latin polities or principalities in the east around the Kingdom of Jerusalem and other principalities. And that kicks off the whole crusading movement, which continues on into the late Middle Ages, really.
Yes, this is the big one. And this is, if you're as you say, Latin Christian, this is the most successful one because none of the other ones are as successful as this one. Yeah. This is the big one. So as we're talking about, there's a whole bunch of action that's happening, things that are happening, unbelievable things that are happening, including cannibalism. So of course, people are going to send notice back to the West. And so what we're going to be talking about is writing letters, and some of the letters that we have that have survived, and you have some suspicions about those letters. But before we get into that, let's start talking about how letter writing is happening at this time. So who is writing letters? Is it everybody? Is it just a few people who's writing letters at this time?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think we like to think that we understand medieval letter writing because we write lots of letters or now electronic messages ourselves. I think we like to think we know the format. They're structured in not a dissimilar way. They have, a dear so-and-so, and they end with, keep well, and they have a date. And we think, oh, this is quite similar to modern letter writing. But actually, the whole process and culture, epistolary culture around letter writing is very different, I think, from what we do today. So who's writing letters? Well, we think probably lots of people and lots of sections of society. The problem we have is survival of source material. So the letters that we have surviving now are those written by high status individuals or about important events that are archived properly by kings or popes or bishops or monasteries. So we tend to have a pretty skewed picture on what kind of letters were written. And that's really down to the survival of source material, the way it's archived, who has the machinery and the personnel to be able to keep these letters. There's a really interesting collection of lost letters, which has been published fairly recently, which shows that a lot of people in society are writing completely ordinary letters about things like wine orders, students writing to their parents saying, I need more money because I've spent everything. And just really kind of standard letters, the kind that we would write and know about today. But I think they're very ephemeral. They don't tend to survive except in these formularies. So we don't really have a really good picture of the exact sort of range of the panoply of letters that are being written. We can assume there are probably a lot more being written than we have evidence for. How are they being written? Well, we are conditioned to write letters from one person to another in a pretty private mode of transmission. So one writes a letter to someone and it's really thought of probably for their eyes only. But in the Middle Ages, letters are really seen in a different way as being much more open documents. So you're writing something almost for publication, to use that word. It's something to be disseminated. It's seen as an open document which a lot of people are going to see and interact with and hear about. And one of the key things is that also this is a big mode of transmission is oral. So we're used to reading letters quietly, silently in our heads, and that's how we receive them. But actually in the Middle Ages, a lot of them being read aloud. So we're thinking about oral transmission, and the dynamism that brings with it is something quite different from what we're used to. And people can be changing the messages as well when they're reading them aloud and interacting with. They're much more plastic than the kind of text we're used to dealing with. So they're probably written by a large range of society. We don't have evidence for most of those, though. Oral transmission is really key, and we're dealing with the archiving of these letters. In terms of how they're actually written, again, is different from today. So one of the Crusader leaders, so the book is about First Crusade letters, which are mostly written by middle ranking and high ranking Crusade leaders on campaign in the East. They're not going to physically write the letter themselves. They're going to have a chaplain or a clerk who's going to write it on their behalf. And so there's an interesting question there about who's actually authoring the letter. Is it the named author? Say we've got a crusade leader like Bohemond of Taranto. Are those his exact words? Is he dictating the letter to a scribe who's adding bits? Are they changing things? Is it a council of crusade leaders and their advisors who are all chipping in, and then it gets sort of codified as a text? It's a much more dynamic and really exciting mode of transmission of ideas, which is really interesting to kind of pick apart. And I think that the way that people have approached them up until now have been through sort of straight historical lenses. They've taken the letters all being genuine, and actually we need to account for that complexity in the way these are produced and transmitted.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And even if we are only thinking about email, when we think about letters, it might be that Victorian idea where you have them all like bundled up in a velvet ribbon and you keep them. But back in the day, people are using parchment, which is expensive. And I think that it's important to remember you get a letter, you'd read it out loud. And I'm thinking about the type of newsletters that people send at Christmas or something you're supposed to read aloud to the family or pass to the family. So you get this letter and then you scrape off the parchment and reuse it. And so this is like a big reason why we don't have ordinary letters, right?
Precisely, yeah. And I think obviously when the creation of those palimpsests where text have been written over the original text has been scraped out, it creates all these really interesting questions about what texts were there circulating in the Middle Ages. We don't have any more of those letters which have survived. And also one of the big things is about what type of manuscript it is. So the ones we have surviving, all apart from one in my book that I look at, are all in codex form. So they're all preserved in books. And that's a format which privileges preservation over these ephemeral modes of transmission. As you're saying, these kind of single sheet letters that are being sent out, read aloud, sort of used, and then scraped clean and used again. Because as you say, the parchment's super expensive. You can't afford to just throw it away or keep it for posterity maybe. And so we've got to imagine there's probably a lot more of these single sheet and pamphlet letters that are being transmitted in the Middle Ages that we just simply don't have anymore. And so it's this whole lost world of ideas, of text, of letters, which I think is really fascinating. And just trying to excavate those from the ones we do have preserved in books is a really exciting thing to do.
Yes, I mean, it is such a big thing for us as medievalists when you have Victorians who have all the paper in the world. And, here we are like looking in the spaces between and trying to find things. So as you're saying, the letters that you're looking at for the First Crusade, you find them in a codex, so in a book. So these are already not the originals. Why are they in books?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. And I think the answer is it sort of testifies to the importance and interest that these letters had in the Middle Ages. So there's two ways in which they're transmitted in books. Well, kind of three ways actually. So first is there is actually one pamphlet letter. So there's one of the letters by one of the major crusade leaders, Stephen of Blois. He writes two letters that we know of, sends back to his wife Adela in Blois and Chartres. And one of these actually survives in a pamphlet form. So it was two sort of unbound pages, basically, like a modern pamphlet that contained his letter that was obviously circulating in the Middle Ages. And at some point later on, someone took that pamphlet and bound it into a book, which means that we have it surviving. So that's a really, really rare survivor. And it's, I think, a good indication that a lot more are circulating like this. We just don't have them anymore. So the other two ways, how do they get into books otherwise? Well, some of them are copied as parts of organized programs of copying. So you've got someone a monk. These are all produced in monastic context as well. So later in the Middle Ages, obviously, a lot of copying is done in a professional way by professional lay scribes, but actually in this period and this type of material, it's all monastic context that we have surviving. So it's monks producing these letters. They're copying them as part of programs they know about, and so they kind of an organized way. But you've also got, really fascinatingly, these letters, First Crusade letters, which are copied in a really spontaneous manner. So they're copied not in the main pages or folios of the book, but actually they're copied onto the fly leaves. So in a modern book, obviously, when you open it up, you've got these fly leaves that are blank, or they might just have the title on and so on. And these fly leaves are also there in the Middle Ages and medieval books to kind of protect them. And so some of the letters from the First Crusade are copied onto these blank fly leaves. So how do they get there? Well, I think that what's happening is books are traveling a lot. And I think that we like to think that medieval books kind of don't travel a lot, but they do. We've got lots of evidence of them crossing seas, being carried around. A lot of them have got these fabulous leather wraparound covers which protect them from, wind and rain and so on. And I think what's going on is these single sheet manuscript letters are traveling around, and these books are traveling around as well with monks and other people. And when they come into contact with a First Crusade letter and they realize someone's got one, they're kind of collecting them. It's almost like kind of Pokemon, I guess. You're trying to like you're trying to catch them as you find them in the wild. And they do find some of these and they write them down on these fly leaves. And I think that's really interesting because it shows there's a certain amount of interest and urgency there in copying these texts and their transmission. And people, I imagine people are probably going around in the Middle Ages and saying, hey, I've got this letter from the First Crusade, do you want a copy? And someone else is saying, oh yeah, great, I do. And copying it down in this spontaneous way because they're copied with loads of texts which have nothing to do with the Crusade. So they're copied with, I don't know, saints' lives in miscellanies, other historical texts, philosophical texts. There's a really wide range of stuff. And so I think this suggests that these letters from the First Crusade and the miraculous events of the Crusade have such a wide interest, not quite approaching universal interest, but a very wide interest. And people really want to get these and collect them. And what's interesting, of course, is that actually in the Middle Ages, we now have access to, there's 22 letters from the First Crusade, which is a really big corpus of letters. If you're interested in letter writing culture, this is a really big collection from the end of the 11th century and the very beginning of the 12th century. That's very rare. And I think that's testament to the fact people are super interested in these. But of course, we can see that whole corpus. So we can look at all 22 and we can compare them and it's fascinating. But actually in the Middle Ages, probably people are coming across one letter or two. And there's collections of First Crusade letters. The most we have is 3. Maybe there were more. Probably there were people who collected more. But actually, people aren't having access to all of these letters. And some of it, I think, is spontaneous copying.
I love that, where you have a book in front of you and you're like, oh my gosh, this is my one chance to write down what it says in the Crusade letter, and you write it right at the beginning. So like the fly leaves being the beginning of book, as you're saying, of the blank part, this is a great spot to collect stuff. Okay, so we have 22 letters, and you start to have some suspicions that they are not completely accurate.
Yeah.
You've used some words instead of, you don't want to use forgeries. You're using words like confections or inventions. So what started your spidey senses tingling about this? Because a lot of these letters, including ones from the Pope, for example, people have taken as straight as being more or less faithfully copied. What started you getting suspicious about these letters?
Yeah, well, I've been working on the letters for a little while. So I started working on the first because I got this chance manuscript find in Munich, and I was teaching a class, and they've got this great collection of manuscripts there. And so I thought I'd take the students from the university and we'll go and look at some of these letters. And I found a manuscript that had the wrong date on it, and I thought this is really interesting. And so I started looking at it, and I realized there was like a whole new recension of this letter, like a variant text that no one had published before. And so I published that, and I started working on the letters and working them up. And then there's a great scholar called Dr. Simon Parsons who wrote this fabulous article about the letters of Stephen of Blois. And in that, he takes these letters and kind of problematizes their authenticity and looks at them in a different way, because up until this point, all the letters have been taken as really trustworthy eyewitness reportage. This idea that actually the chronicle sources, call them chronicles, these are very trustworthy sources. These chronicle sources are inflected by literary agendas of the authors, and so therefore we have to be careful in using them. But the letters, on the other hand, are very trustworthy because they're written at the moment in the Crusade camp, and they're just reporting what they see without any literary agenda, and therefore we can use them. They're pretty safe sources, and we can just pretty much use them. I'm generalizing a little, but that was pretty much how they were viewed. And then in Simon Parsons' article, he looks at these letters of Stephen of Blois and says, actually, We can see literary agendas at work in the letters, and there's intertextualities with other sources. So there are parts of these letters which are similar to other longer sources, and just problematizing like how these are put together, and actually can we take them at face value. And so looking at the rest of the corpus, you can see actually there's a pretty significant chunk of the corpus of First Crusade letters that are either confected completely, and I think this is a really interesting mode of engagement with text and history in the Middle Ages and the Crusade narrative, or they're authentic letters that have been modified and tweaked in some way. And actually that makes up the bigger part. So we've got a number of letters, including from, I think, from Pope Urban II, that have been used to construct these really massive, overarching, analytical superstructures about how the crusade is organized. And actually, if we look at the letters, they seem to be, some of them are very short. It looks like maybe had things cut out of them. They appear to have been modified. They might have had things added, possibly. And certainly some of the letters are very dynamic, and the letters from crusade leaders are very popular and from the crusader host. And when they enter transmission, what I think is going on with a lot of these, like the letters of Stephen of Blois with Anselm of Ribemont, for instance, or one of the Crusader leaders' letters from 11th of September 1098, is that they enter transmission, then people are obviously changing them, they're adapting them and modifying them, adding something new, updating them with new information. And so each copy is not exactly the same, and they're not necessarily the same as what was actually written in the Crusader camp or in the papal chancery and so on. So the book is very much about looking at these letters in a different way in terms of trying to work out, are they confected? Are they authentic? Which parts of them are authentic? Which parts have been added? And a lot of parts have been added later on. But then what I want to do is to bring the corpus of letters together, both confected, authentic, and ones that have been modified, and to see what does that tell us about European society, how they're engaging with the crusade. And that's really fascinating. So scholars talk about, like a parchment mirror, and you can use this like a parchment mirror to hold up and look at the reflection of medieval society, what they're thinking about the crusading movement. Why are they inventing whole letters? Why are they adding bits to these letters? And it's really interesting to look at the letters, not just through a historical lens, as most people have done before. So they've looked at them to acquire facts, what actually happened on the crusade. I want to look at them in a different way. I want to look at them, what does this tell us about the communities that are writing, reciting, modifying, inventing these letters? Why are they doing that? What can that tell us about especially ecclesiastical communities and how they interact with the idea and news of the Crusades?
Yes, well, this is exactly what I'm going to ask you because I think there have to be some listeners who are listening to the idea of people copying letters from the Crusade and adding stuff or creating letters from whole cloth. And I'm sure there are people who are listening right now and being like, what? Because this is so different from the way that we collect information. We want it to be as precise as possible. This is why we have quotation marks, So why are people doing this? Why would you get a letter from the Crusade and add things to it? Or why would you create one just out of thin air?
Yeah, I think it goes back to, well, I think there's a number of things at play here. So one is enthusiasm for the crusade. I think they're really interested by it. It's a big news story when it happens, and they want to know the latest news, and they want to interact with it. They want to be part of it. And that's a way of them doing that by inventing letters and so on. They're probably, to reconstruct this lost oral story world that exists around the crusade. I think that's fascinating. So probably, some of these invented letters, they may be a sort of a recreation of maybe a genuine letter that circulated at the time, or an oral story that's now been lost. And so, but we see what someone knew about the crusade from this oral story world, and they wrote it down in the form of a letter. It's a creative way of engaging with the past, which a lot of scholars have looked at in terms of people are playing with the past in an interesting way. I think it comes down to the fact that we shouldn't assume there's a binary distinction between fact and fiction in the Middle Ages. And actually, when it comes to something like the Crusade, this story world that exists around the crusading movement is something where I don't think there's really clear delineating or dividing lines between what's fabula, so what's the kind of something invented, and what's historia, what's history. I think those exist at the same time, and they're deeply enmeshed. And so I think their whole way of approaching fact and fiction and stories and great crusading deeds is maybe more nuanced and complex than we would assume. And I think we're trying to pick that apart. It's also an idea that I've tried to propound in the book is about scribal crusading. So there's a lot of scholars who are working on this idea that you can take part in the crusade in different ways. So you don't just have to pick up a sword and go out to the east. You can go on a virtual pilgrimage. You can contribute by funding someone else to go, and so on. And what I argue in the book is that actually that we can see in these letters and all manuscripts of crusading texts actually scribal crusading, and the way they're interacting with the letters by copying them out as a work on behalf of God. This is a divine work. But also, some of the new manuscripts that I found have these kind of introductory rhymes, for instance, or inscriptions, which say how someone should receive the letter. And actually, there's one manuscript in Würzburg, and it says those who want to know about Jerusalem should read this letter, and they should praise the events, because actually it's going to multiply the glory of the event on earth. So they're not just reading the letter and saying, "Oh, that's an interesting letter. I'm done now." Like, actually, I've done that. What they're doing is that's actually being seen, I think, as a way of contributing to the crusading movement. You're interceding with God in a similar way to going on a virtual pilgrimage and so on. You're praying on behalf of the crusaders. And that's what we see in a lot of the letters, that, they're asking for the genuine letters from the First Crusade. One of the big concerns of the authors is that people at home pray for them. They're trying to establish a dialogue with communities at home who are going to pray for them and pray for their dead. And you see this in the original parts of the letters. What's fascinating is you see then in the letters that have been added to or confected, people are responding to that. They're in dialogue with the Crusaders, and they're adding lists of names of people who have died on the Crusades. They're updating the text of the letter, and they're saying, these are the people who died at the siege of Antioch. These are the people who died at the siege of Nicaea. Pray for them. And so they're contributing to the Crusades in how they interact with the letters.
I think that is so fascinating and so important. I'm really glad that you brought that up, because in all sorts of medieval writing, you have this invocation, please pray for us. And we have obviously a tradition of mentioning people's names out in church or at masses. And so being able to name these people, it's super important to their entire afterlife. It gets them out of purgatory, it gets them into heaven. And so it's important work. And I think it's hard to think of creating fiction for the Crusade as being work. But I think that you're right, that these monks and scribes picture it as being work. This is divine work that we are doing that's important, that's going to make a difference in the heavenly calculations that are going to be happening.
Totally. And I think that's one of the main things I'm trying to do in the book as well, is that to put the letters from the First Crusade in that wider ecclesiastical context, religious context. So I think that's really crucial, that we don't look at parts of history, say like the Crusades, in their own silo and sort of portion them off from the rest of the history. Actually, to understand them in this new way, I think we have to locate them in those monastic and ecclesiastical communities that are producing these texts.
I think it's also important to remember that this is part of a tradition that is recognizable, and this is something that you established in the book as well. So you have a letter, quote unquote, letter writing tradition that has gone back for a long time. So I'm thinking of the letter from Alexander to Aristotle, right? So Alexander the Great supposed to have written this letter, and it says, I've just come across hippos. It's amazing. So the people who are used to coming across this form are not looking for the same things that we are when we're looking at a letter from back in the day or from our grandparents or something like that. They are recognizing that this is a form being used. So when they look at it, they're looking at something different.
100%. I think that's super important, that there's this really long history of fictitious, of invented correspondence between famous people. And that's a way for the scribes to engage with the past. And it's a kind of entertainment as well for them. I think the way the Middle Ages is portrayed in popular culture and movies, it's kind of grey, muddy kind of world where there's no joy and no one laughed. But actually, people are, want entertainment. They're like us, but that's how they don't have Netflix. So that's what you do. You confect a crusade letter instead. So.
That's right. Just sitting around on a Saturday night being like, what am I going to do with myself? I'm going to create a crusade letter. But thinking of these as being useful tools, it makes so much more sense that you would keep some of the things and take out some other things, because I think sometimes when we're looking at letters today or looking at older letters, you might be looking at something like, please take care of my cat. And for us, that's really sentimental and important. But if you're copying a letter and someone says, please take care of my cat, like, that's not very important to the actual story. Well, we could just cut that out. When you're thinking of this letter as a tool, it makes sense that you'd be cutting out things like, feed the cat.
Yeah, and I think we should see, as you say, these letters as tools. They're also being used it's sort of power plays really on the political stage of Europe. So you've got people like Stephen of Blois. Why is he writing letters back to his wife and his followers in the West? Why is he transmitting narrative from the Crusade? Because I think it accrues him prestige and renown, and it's going to shore up his position, firstly within the Crusade leadership. So he's actually a leader who had aspirations to be the overall leader of the whole crusade and appears to have been for a time, but his authority was shaky. And so how do you shore that up? Well, one of the ways is through soft power, and it's through using letters and text and narrative, and then transmitting those in the West as well, of course, increased his renown. And okay, so he leaves the crusade early and is sort of pretty heavily criticized for that. But up until that point, these letters have been political tools that he'd been using, and then they're obviously shaped as well in reception by the people who receive those. They want to add bits and they want to change them. And so I think what's fascinating about the letter text is because manuscripts are so dynamic and they're so plastic and malleable that people can change them, and they are changing them to suit their local interests. So you've got, say, I mentioned that manuscript I found in Munich, which had a new variant text of one of the big letters from the First Crusade announcing its success. That letter is produced in what's now modern southern Germany and Austria, and it excises the passages about the Norman and French knights because they want to align sort of Germanic houses, religious houses and communities more with the First Crusade, and they want to cut out, I think, the connection with the French and the Normans in their region. That's what they're interested in. You see that kind of modification going on suited to local concerns, which is really interesting.
As you're talking about this, it's making me think about the ways in which, especially in a monastic context, you're using information and organizing information perhaps in a way that's going to tell a story, that's going to create a saint, for example. And I'm wondering if this is part of the project of these letters as well, is to take these figures that have been very important, captured Jerusalem, and start to build a legend about them so that they can become bigger than just normal people. Do you think that's part of it?
Oh, totally, yeah. And I think that's, people like Beaumont say, I mean, scholars think he's probably one of the most famous, he probably is the most famous person in medieval Europe, Western Europe after the First Crusade, and that he's able to use that then to get great sort of alliances and marriage and so on, and political capital. And I think it goes back to that story world that's around their crusading deeds, and that it's not just what they actually do on crusade, but it's what people think they do as well. And that's really interesting. And I think it goes back as well to that not drawing too fine of a dividing line between fiction and reality in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, because I'm thinking that if you are creating a letter, so it's Saturday night, you're creating a letter, you're not going to create one from Uncle Fred, right? You're going to create one. You're going to create one from somebody that's important, right? That's somebody that's a big figure. Because my thought process was thinking about the letters from the Pope, for example, that you have included in the book. Is it audacious to put words in the mouth of the Pope? And not really if you're not thinking of the Pope as just a guy. If you're thinking of the Pope as a figure, then it makes more sense to take him on as a character and write fan fiction about him,
Yeah, totally. And I think that one of the letters in particular, there's a letter which I think is an authentic letter from the Crusade leaders. It's from 11th of September 1098, which they send back to the West, and they address it to the Pope. And then someone adds a postscript where it says, one of the Crusade leaders is Bohemond of Taranto, okay, this great figure of great renown, this great warrior. Someone adds a postscript which says, so you've got the leader's letter, and they talk to the Pope saying, this is what's happened on the Crusades so far, and they update him. And then suddenly it's got almost like a postscript and says, I, Bohemond, and then it continues on. And then it starts berating the Pope and saying, what the hell are you doing? Like, why are you letting people, releasing people from their crusade vows? Send them over to the East right now. Like, why are you doing this? I'm very disappointed in you, Pope. And this is kind of crazy. Like, no, Beaumont's not going to write to the Pope and say that. There's a complete mismatch in the tone between the postscript and the rest of the letter. But scholars have taken that as being, oh, well, this is Beaumont criticizing the Pope. This is what Beaumont thinks. And it's like, well, no, actually, it's not. And if you look at the manuscripts, and I think one of the key things what I wanted to do was go back to the manuscripts, because a lot of scholars had worked on the letters from the printed editions, which was a brilliant edition, but it's fairly dated now. It's from 1901, and it was a superb scholarly feat. But actually, the kind of principles that Heinrich Hagemeyer was using when he was editing these texts are different from modern principles in editing text and in engaging with manuscripts. And actually, then when you go back and look at the manuscripts, you can see, oh, wait a minute, this postscript that's added on isn't in all of the other manuscripts. It's just in this one, but he put it in the main text. And so everyone thought it got translated into English, and people think, oh, this is what the actual text is. And actually, that's a variant. It's a fascinating variant, super important for thinking about reception and transmission, but actually not what the Crusaders originally wrote. And so this letter with the Bohemond postscript where he berates the Pope, that's not in all of the manuscripts actually. And so again, those editorial choices have shaped how we think about the Crusade, and looking at it and peeling away those layers in a textual excavation brings us this new knowledge about the Crusade, but also about this letterizing culture and how people are using these texts as political and ecclesiastical tools.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that scholarship is really headed in that direction, the direction that you're heading in, where you have to go back to the manuscript if you can. You have to go back to the original language if you can, because so much has been lost in translation, in transmission. And so I think that this is really good work that's happening because you can find out more things when you go back to the original. So when you were, and you could correct me if I have this wrong, when you were looking at the canon of Crusade letters, you found that there's more authenticity, let's say, in the ones that come after the fall of Jerusalem, right? And so you're thinking, and again, like I might be putting words in your mouth, so correct me if I'm wrong, that you're thinking that it might actually be working sort of backwards. So once Jerusalem falls, then you have more confections written that would be sort of prequels to these letters, because all of a sudden there is a lot more interest than there was before. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Let's think about them working backwards, and this idea of creation of prequels, and like as you say, they use the term fan fiction. And that's exactly what it is. It is fan fiction essentially, and they're really used to this historical repair work. This is a mode of engagement with the past, with text that monastic communities are really familiar with. And, they've got letters like there's the Sunday letter, which is this supposed letter which comes down from God and says you have to observe Sunday as a holy day. You have the apocryphal gospels about Jesus' childhood. So, we want to know more about Jesus. We don't know much about his childhood. People invent it. They're really used to engaging with the past in this way. And so actually it feels completely natural for them to start to invent this stuff to fill in the gaps. You've got these historical lacunae. Like, what do? Well, you invent a letter. And the thing is that it's not necessarily a complete invention if you know that this happened, or there was actually a letter which circulated, but it's now been lost. And what's quite interesting, I think, is that, we have to be careful about a teleological reading from start to finish of the First Crusade, looking to Urban II's genius at Claremont, where he says, go to Jerusalem, and then where they go through these great hardships and battles and sieges, and then they get to Jerusalem and they capture it in this miraculous event. And it's really easy to plot a very clear line from A to B. But actually, it's not necessarily the case that, firstly, that he was promoting Jerusalem as the target at Claremont. I think, in accordance with other scholars like Professor Georg Strack, that actually probably he's talking about liberating the Byzantine churches and the Eastern Christians first, that then organically this idea about crusade taps into this idea of pilgrimage, that Jerusalem becomes very quickly attached to the crusade idea, and that then the papacy gets fully on board with that. That's, I think I agree with that interpretation. And, it's not necessarily true that everyone knew exactly, what was going to happen right at the end of the crusade, and then they're copying stuff down as it goes because they're on this great mission and they know they're going to succeed. Of course they don't know they're going to succeed. Like, this is a suicide mission. Like, no one's supposed to be coming back from this alive, but somehow miraculously they succeed. And so then you want to plot that clear path backwards then, and to massage the material so that it fits into that story. And that's what I think they're doing with some of these texts.
Yes, absolutely. And it makes sense that the letters that you would have more factual information, you don't need to tweak them very much if they're coming triumphantly back from Jerusalem saying, I can't believe it. Can you believe this? There's not much to do with those because they already have it all.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the thing is that probably my suspicion is that actually how much interest is really taken in the First Crusade before they capture Jerusalem. I don't know. Maybe people think these guys are crazy. Like, we're never going to hear from them again. And then they're like, exactly. They captured Jerusalem. And then they're like, we need to copy some of this stuff. No one's been copying down any of the letters they said. So I think we've got to be careful about that as well, and thinking about where and when the impetus for copying these texts comes from, what the agendas are of the people copying them.
Yeah, it's so funny to look at this from a human nature standpoint where you have people who are being, I knew all along that this was going to work out.
Yeah.
This was definitely always going to work out. I was on that side.
Yeah, exactly.
It's totally not what happened. As you say, I think everyone was just waving goodbye and not expecting to
Yeah,
see
yeah.
them ever again. But when they came back triumphant, this is wonderful news and we have to turn it into an amazing story. Okay, so this is a question that you probably get asked in a scholarly context ever since you started working on this, and that is, what is at stake if these 22 letters you've looked at, you've found a lot of them are very creative and perhaps not factual. What's at stake here when it comes to crusading history?
Yeah, I think there's two big things at stake here. The first is actually the history of the Crusade. So the book is called Rewriting the Crusade, which is a title which I owe to my fabulous publisher, Caroline Palmer of Boydell and Brewer, who
Right.
is simply wonderful. And really the thinking behind that is actually people are rewriting these letters. So the texts are coming, people are adding them, adding to them, modifying them, and they're rewriting the First Crusade in terms of rewriting the letters, but also actually the research into the letters in the book is also rewriting the actual history of the First Crusade as well, or central aspects of it. So, I mean, there's some really key points of the history of the First Crusade that this new evidence reshapes. The first is actually the history of the campaign itself. So there's this idea that the papal legate Adhemar of Le Puy, he's the spiritual leader of the crusade. He's one of the absolute leading figures. There's this idea that he leaves the crusade army in Palestine and pops across to Cyprus to write a letter with the Greek patriarch of Jerusalem in exile, Simeon, who's on Cyprus, and that he's away from the crusade for a substantial length of time while he writes this letter. That doesn't make any sense. Like, why would he do that? Well, if we see the two letters that they supposedly co-wrote as being confections because of also the content, the style, the tone, and everything, and the agendas, then actually Adhemar didn't leave the Crusade host. He didn't go to Cyprus. This changes one of the key aspects of what we know about the history of the actual campaign. It changes the history of the relationship with Byzantium. So scholars have said that actually, because they wrote these letters together, that there was a really close working relationship between the Latin and Byzantine churches. And actually, had a really good relationship up until fairly late in the Crusade. Well, that's not true either. You've got this idea that they're actually the Greek patriarch Simeon and Adhemar are leading the crusade together, and that's one of the key elements of the crusade leadership. That we need to revise that as well. You've got this evidence of Adhemar's conception of his role. So one of the really key things is what his role is on the crusade as a spiritual leader and as a legate, as a papal legate. Well, we can't use that anymore as evidence of the conception of his role. And you've also like the first use of the word crusader in one of these letters. So there's a lot of scholarly debate about when do they start to use the word crusader. So the word crusader doesn't actually exist in the Middle Ages, but we do have a Latin word, cruce signatus, so someone who's signed with the cross. And the first recorded use of it supposedly is in one of these First Crusade letters, but actually the letter seems to be a confection. So it's probably fairly early 12th century, but actually we can't say that they used the word cruce signatus during the First Crusade itself or among the leadership. So it's also rewriting the history of the crusade. The big second thing I think that's at stake is a new understanding of the crusading movement, basically, and how we can use manuscripts to illuminate that, how people are doing this scribal crusading, as I mentioned, how these communities are receiving and interacting with the history of the crusade, how it's being transmitted, what it tells us about ecclesiastical communities and the crusade idea, how they're getting physically involved, but also intellectually as well. What are they thinking about? How are they building it into their liturgical and para-liturgical praxis? And there's lots of really great evidence for that, which I think is, of a lot of interest in terms of thinking about how monastic communities tick and how the crusading movement interacts with those in the Middle Ages.
It's funny because you come across so sweet and nice and gentle, and you've just dropped a giant bomb in the middle of crusading studies, just quietly. This is going to change everything. How are you feeling about that? This is not the question I usually ask people, but how are you feeling about like just blowing up crusading studies?
I love crusading studies. And I think that this is I don't think I'm blowing it up. I hope not. I hope there's not a big target on my back. I don't know. No, I think I guess that's how historiography works, isn't it? Is that we're looking to push fields in new directions and to get new insights and to get new ideas. And what I really hope with the book is that I don't want this book to be the last word on letter writing and the First Crusade or First Crusade sources and so on. I think actually if you write a book like that, then you've got a problem because you've just killed your field. Like that's not, I don't want to do that. Like I want this to be, I hope that people will engage with the ideas in the book and actually think, oh yeah, actually this helps me to think about these other Crusade texts in this way, or more broadly, this helps me to think about medieval letter writing culture in that way. And so I'm gonna pursue that, and that actually it's going to hopefully lead to these new directions. And there's, I haven't said everything I want to in this book, and there's still a lot left to say about First Crusade letters. And I really hope that other people are going to take this up and run with some of the ideas in this.
That is, I think, the perfect place to end this, where you have given out the call, other people have a look at these crusading letters, see what you think, and then start a new conversation. And I think this is very exciting work that you're doing. And I'm so glad that you came on the podcast to tell us all about it. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks so much, Daniel. It's been such a pleasure being your guest. Thank you.
To find out more about Tom's work, you can visit his website at thomaswsmith.co.uk. His new book is Rewriting the First Crusade, Epistolary Culture in the Middle Ages. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on this week, Peter?
Hey, I have a new marketing coordinator.
A new marketing coordinator?
Yes.
Tell us everything.
Well, his name's Rollo.
Okay.
He's about 10 weeks old right now.
And adorable.
Yes, he's a bit adorable, a bit playful. He's not doing too much work yet, but I'll get him into line.
Yes, Peter is recording in his living room, which is why it's a bit echoey, so I can meet his new kitten. So cute. You are definitely posting pictures, right?
Definitely. We're going to get him up and working very soon. Got to get that content out. So.
What have you two been working on this week?
Yeah, there's some fun little news out of Denmark. The Rugby Viking Center has unveiled a recreation of a 9th century church.
Nice.
They spent about 3 years researching and creating 50 murals on the inside. So I'm going to take a look at some of the pictures and video we've got on the site, and it's really impressive. A very bright space using kind of Carolingian materials. And the church is actually based on one that existed in Rugby, the first church that was built there by a Christian missionary in the 9th century. So it's pretty cool stuff. Rugby Viking Center is this living history site with kind of a longhouse, fortress, other kind of markets, stuff like that. Allows people to experience the Middle Ages. But yeah, they do take their work fairly seriously. And they've created something pretty awesome.
Yeah, that does sound awesome. I love it when you get to see art the way it would have looked back in the day, because it's almost always a lot more colorful than we imagine.
So we've got that. We've got a ton of news, and we also have this piece on medieval ABCs. Just like, when we were kids, we had these ABC books. There's a Middle English poem called the ABC of Aristotle, which is like, hey, we're going to learn some words, but it's more about like morals. One version starts like, be not too amorous, too adventurous, nor argue too much. So,
I mean, that's a lesson for kids, right? Don't argue, kids. Start on your Greek philosophy early.
Yes. So we have like 2 versions of the poem. I came across 2 versions, and I thought I put them in comparison, and you can see how one author kind of changes a bit, but it was a real popular poem from the mid 15th century to the early 16th century. That was like all the rage with the kids, I guess.
Yeah, it's the toddler trend of I'm kidding. They would have been learning it older, but yeah, it's nice to see trendy stuff appearing in history, and this would have counted as that for sure.
Yeah, and Aristotle gets some love too, even though he had nothing to do with it.
No, I know. So many things attributed to Aristotle in the Middle Ages. He's just he just does everything. He can do anything.
Indeed. So we got that plus much, much more on the website.
Excellent. And Peter, you actually listened to my new podcast this week. What did you think?
Yes. Yeah. Oh man, it's so awesome. It's interesting to see you do a narrative form, telling the story throughout. It's wonderfully produced. So it belongs. The only thing is, I don't hear you laugh.
I know. That's the thing I get the most comments on in general, is like, people find my laugh to be something they notice definitely about the podcast. And it's not really in the Iron King. You are right.
I miss it, but beyond that, it's off to a great start. I love how you talk about Philip, his father, his brother, just put out their personalities a bit and offer that to us. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it.
Thank you. You get to know the family a little bit and what it's like for Philip to ascend to the throne at age 17 and the dramatic circumstances that lead to it.
I'm very much looking forward to the other episodes, but episode 1 is now actually out for the world.
Yes, yes. And if you like listening to me laugh at ridiculousness, the bonus episodes involve Dan and me talking more about the Sicilian Vespers, about Aragon, about Philip. And I definitely do laugh when I'm in conversation with Dan. As you will know from last week's episode, it's kind of something that happens when we get together. Yeah, so if you enjoy The Iron King, you can get the bonus episodes as well as on This Is History Plus. Well, Peter, I'm really glad that you liked episode 1.
I did indeed. Yes, I'm really happy for you. This was awesome stuff.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to try new things. And there are all sorts of new things always happening on medievalist.net, right?
Indeed, indeed.
Okay, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us what's on the website.
Thanks.
As I've mentioned in the last 2 episodes, there's a whole lot going on around here that's new and exciting, including my new 6-part spin-off series from Dan Jones's hit podcast, This Is History. It's called The Iron King, and it deals with Philip IV of France, aka Philip the Fair, and the wild, wild ride that is his reign. So, if you've ever wondered what happened to the Templars, or how the Capetian dynasty fell apart, or if you've ever wondered if I can do narrative podcasting, now's your moment. Just look up This Is History on your favorite podcasting platform and hit subscribe. Or if you want more history and more medieval Dans, you can sign up for This Is History Plus and get all episodes ad-free, as well as weekly bonus episodes where, speaking of wild rides, Dan and I nerd out about what didn't fit in the mainstream content, and whatever else is on our minds. Episode 1 of The Iron King, featuring the Sicilian Vespers, the Aragonese Crusade, and Philip's rise to power, is out now. This is the part where I say, but wait, there's more, because it's the 100th anniversary of the Richard III Society this year, and as part of the Canadian celebration, I'll be giving a talk at the Centenary Luncheon at Montgomery's Inn in Toronto on Saturday, July the 6th. If you're interested in hearing my talk and you won't be in Toronto, that's okay, because the event will also be available on Zoom. Ticket sales will close on June 15th, so get your RSVP in ASAP. To find out more, please visit Richard III, that is richardii.ca/branch-news. Thank you to everyone who so generously supports my podcast and the work of other indie historians through medievalist.net's Patreon page. As you know, patrons can access a whole range of goodies in addition to good karma. And thank you also to those who have already picked up some stylin' medieval merch. If you've ever seen my super sweet 5-minute medievalist logo and thought, hey, that'd make an awesome t-shirt, this is your lucky day, because medievalist.net has teamed up with TeePublic to bring you shirts, mugs, totes, stickers, and more. Now you can spread the medieval love even further by wearing your support on your sleeve. Head over to teepublic.com/stores/medievalistsnet to grab your 5-minute medievalist shirt and let everyone know how awesome you are. That's teepublic.com/stores/medievalistsnet. For everything from letters to fetters, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.